بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمد شاكرين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد كلما ذكرك الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكرك الغافلون. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Today's discussion regarding the Syrian events that have occurred in Syria, the rebel takeover of Aleppo, as well as the response of the Assad regime and the Russian allies of the Assad regime. So there are a few preliminaries which I would want to cover prior to delving into this subject. Firstly, the common misconception regarding those who analyze such unfolding events as being pure Assadists or Baathists, which is absolute nonsense and conflated, taken clearly out of context. Baathism, which started in the 1940s in Damascus, was founded by Mish'al Aflaq, a Christian who found the idea of Arab socialism and what became known as Ba'athism. A Ba'athi is a person who believes in the Ba'athist ideology, which is basically socialism and Arab nationalism. Ba'athists, whether they claim to be Sunni or Shia, whether they claim to be Nusayri, which are commonly known as Alawis, Baathists do not believe in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, prior to Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, prior to him, there were many Baathists who claimed to be Sunni as in origin. Sunni here being claimed as a term of identity, which is not a term of belief. And these Baathists, when they arrested a Shaykh Hassan Habannaka, rahimahullah ta'ala, Shaykh Hassan Habannaka, one of the foremost leaders of the ulama of Asham throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, well respected. They in fact imprisoned him and questioned him multiple times. But what they said regarding Al-Quranul Kareem is that the Quran is just a Zahira Arabiya, which means it's just a book of literature that represents Arab culture, the epoch or the peak of Arab literature, and they saw the Quran, they viewed the Quran as a cultural book. So that is Baathism, that is Ba'athi thought, whether it's the Ba'ath party in the regime of Saddam Hussein, or whether it's the Baathists in the regime of the Assad family. And of course, post 1970, we've had the Assad regime governing Syria up until the ahdath, the events of 2010, 2011, when the Syrian public, or much of the Syrian public, rose against Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad. The position of the ulama was divided in the ulama of Syria. Some of the ulama, they exercised their ijtihad and they said that this is a valid uprising. Many of those ulama are respectable ulama who took that position, and that is what their ijtihad led them to. Of course, there was a Shaykh Muhammad Ali al-Sabuni rahimahullah, the great mufassir of the Quran, a great alim, student of Shaykh Najib Sarajuddin rahimahullah of Halab, who took that position, utilized harsh words against his opposition, and that was his ijtihad. Similarly, there were many other ulama, respectable ulama, who took that position. A second group of ulama, they took the position that these ahdath, these events, are fitna, tribulation, and the involvement within these events entails involving yourself in fitna, in tribulation, and they viewed that embroiling yourself in armed struggle against the regime will only exacerbate events rather than uh, bringing these events to an end. A third group of ulama who were more vocal was the group of Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan Al-Bouti, and of course his view, many people viewed him as an alim of the regime, a scholar of the regime, and others saw him and viewed his opinions as being pro-Assad. That is how his opposition interpreted his stance on the Syrian uprising. So these were three groups amongst the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. This is amongst the Ash'ari ulama, this is Ash'ari Maturidi and Athari Hanbali ulama, not Wahhabi ulama, not Salafi ulama. Of course, the Salafi movement saw this as a reason to tarnish Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan Al-Bouti because of his historical debates with Abdul Aziz bin Baz and his historical debates with Shaykh Nasiruddin Al-Albani. He had a debate with the latter on the issue of Allah Madhabiyya, on conformity to madhahib. And then you had people like Adnan Ur'ur, who is one of the exiled Salafi ulama of Syria, who disparaged Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan Al-Bouti rahimahullah ta'ala. But these are the three positions that were taken by the ulama. And since then, the events have unfolded. Of course, in 2010, there was something known as the Arab Spring. Many people, a child, if he was born in the year 2010, would be 14 years old now. And if there was someone who was 10 years old at that time, he would be 24 years old. Many of them would be uninformed, unaware of what actually occurred in that period of time. What we have to realize is that from 1924 and just pre-1924, much of the Khilafah, the Caliphate, was divided, and the last real Sultan of the Muslims, Sultan Abdul Hamid Al-Thani, the second, rahimahullah ta'ala, he died in 1918 when he was removed from his post as Khalifa, as the Caliph. There was the division of the Muslim world, and of course we had the Italian invasion of Libya, the Mujahideen led by Umar al-Mukhtar rahimahullah and the Sunusi Sufi order. They fought the Italian occupation. In Algeria, we had the Sufis led by Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi rahimahullah. In Syria, you had Shaykh al-Imam Badruddin al-Hassani rahimahullah ta'ala and numerous other ulama who opposed the French occupation of Syria, of Bilad al-Sham. And similarly across the world, there were different mujahideen that held their positions against the colonial rule. And then subsequently, there was the division of the Muslim world into nation states. And that has been the position of what is referred to as the Middle East ever since the division of the Caliphate post 1924. Within the Middle East, we've had the rise of Ba'athism, which I mentioned, and the regimes of the Ba'athi, they never had mercy on their political prisoners. This, of course, happened with the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, that the Ikhwan al-Muslimin were tortured. The Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, they were tortured and persecuted by the regimes of Gamal Abdel Nasser, as well as the regime, the Assad regime. And this persecution continued with the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt until today, under the regime of Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, as well as the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Political opposition in general, anyone who holds a different political view in the Middle East, the regimes tend to torture them, imprison them, exile them, or at the very least silence them. So in that context, there was a surge of discontent from Tunisia to Morocco to Algeria to Libya, Egypt, and across the Middle East. Within that surge of discontent rose what became known as the Syrian protests. When the Syrian protests, which were actually organic protests, someone who has lived in Syria will be able to inform you that there was mass discontent among Syrians against the Assad regime because of their torture, imprisonment of political opposition. Those are people who have entered interviews in the Kafr Susay Mukhabarat within Damascus. The Mukhabarat have a center headquarters in Kafr Susay, for which there is now, in that area currently, there are reports of fighting within that area of Kafr Susay as we speak, where the Mukhabarat, the intelligence forces, have centers. The harshness, the qaswa of the Mukhabarat, whether in Egypt or in Iraq or in Syria, leads to dissatisfaction regarding any regime, as well as discontent, and generally dhulm, oppression, leads to that. So the discontent was genuine, there were mass protests, and the Assad regime responded by firing live bullets upon the protesters. And this is something, of course, which was a move which led to the armed opposition, which became known as the Syrian rebel groups, and the surrounding nation states took advantage of this. So you had the UAE, Qatar, Turkey and other state powers that had a vested interest within Asham, Bilad al-Sham, funding and arming different rebel groups. This led to a complex situation from the year 2011 all the way up to 2017. The complexity of the issue was such that in 2014, a man known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he arose not only in Syria but in Iraq. So after the takeover of Raqqa and the takeover of Mosul in Iraq, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he declares himself as Amir al-Mu'mineen. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's movement, which is was known as the ISIS, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and Syria. At that time, the acronym was Daesh. And this movement was a breakaway movement from the Al-Qaeda movement led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was based in Afghanistan at the time. At that time, Afghanistan did not have any independence. Afghanistan was under the occupation of the United States of America. Ayman al-Zawahiri led the Al-Qaeda movement within Bilad al-Sham, and of course Al-Qaeda cooperated to a degree and worked alongside with groups like Free Syrian Army, which was Western backed. Of course, there was a point at which for every 14 or so dollars that were within the CIA range of budget, $1 was allocated to arm and fund Syrian rebels in Syria to disorganize the Bashar regime, to dismantle the Bashar regime, which was a passageway for what Iran refers to as the axis of resistance. Of course, that term axis of resistance was a response to the term axis of evil of George Bush Jr. After the events of 9/11, George Bush Jr. referred to Iran and other states as the axis of evil, but Iran coined the term the axis of resistance. And of course, there are events in Iraq which occurred post-2003 where Shia militias took advantage of the freedom of movement as well as the freedom since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein to counter any Sunni groups who may have been aligned and associated with the Ba'athist regime, the Iraqi regime. So the complexity of the issue involves sectarianism. It involves the Shia militia from Iraq that did persecute Sunni Muslims. It involves the Nusayri group, which are commonly referred to as Alawis, to which the family of Bashar al-Assad belonged to, originating from Ladikia district and the long history that some of the Nusayriya have with the Sunni opposition. So those who belong to the Sunni opposition. Why I mention Sunni opposition? Because there are Sunnis who also belong to the Ba'athist regime. So there are Sunnis who associate themselves with Ba'athism, but as I mentioned, that some of them, they may utilize the epithet of being Sunni in the secular sense as identity politics, because Ba'athism does not recognize the Quran as the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, the Syrian constitution, if you check online, you will be able to find the Syrian constitution. You will find Islam as a source of law within the Syrian constitution. That is something that the Assad regime inherited from the opposition to any violation or tampering of that constitution. That opposition was from the Sunni ulama, the likes of Hassan Habannaka rahimahullah ta'ala, and other ulama who, like Sheikh Makki al-Kattani of Damascus, who took a strong stance against any violations of the Syrian constitution. It's not because the Baathists love religion or Islam so much that they leave Islam within the constitution. In fact, many of the mukhabarat are very ignorant of the deen of Allah. The Syrian mukhabarat did not learn any lessons from the Syrian uprising. The harshness towards political opposition continued to this day. It continues as we speak, and the torture in jails does occur and has occurred and continues to occur. Unfortunately, the regime of Bashar al-Assad has not taken any lessons with those uprisings. But having said that, post 2011, many elements became involved in what became known as the Syrian uprising. Some of those elements were from Iraq. Now, since the fall of Saddam Hussein, you had the likes of Awad Ibrahim, who became known, Awad Ibrahim Bakri, who became known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed caliph. Now, there is no doubt that torture of regimes when they torture people, leads to a psychotic mindset of those rebel fighters. So there are many rebels who have been placed in prisons, have been tortured and even raped. It leads to a psychotic mindset towards the opposition. Later, when we observed post 2014 the crimes of ISIS against many different groups, including Sunnis, but as well as non-Sunnis, like the Yazidis and others, when they carried out crimes, many of those rebels may have been the produce of regimes that torture, psychological torture as well as physical torture. And this has happened in the past with various secret services. Secret services, whether that is the CIA, whether it's the MI6, whether it is the Syrian intelligence groups, they collaborate in order to deport individuals, have them tortured in various ways, and then in many cases they are released from prison. So Awad Ibrahim was imprisoned, was tortured, but later became and rose in the ranks of what became known later as Daesh. Now, Daesh was a breakaway from the main rebel movement of Al-Qaeda. And Daesh ideologically was tied up to Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda, in essence, is Wahhabi, meaning in its religious theology. But Al-Qaeda, when it broke away, it was led by the representative of Al-Qaeda, who is Al-Jawlani. Al-Jawlani is the same individual who is leading the current Syrian rebels in what became later known as Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham. This group, Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham, the acronym of which is HTS, is the group that currently leads the takeover of Halab. So now we observe the takeover of Halab, and of course the excitement this takeover has given to many supporters of the rebel groups is reminiscent of the takeover of Mosul by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi 10 years ago. 10 years ago, suddenly Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi takes over Mosul and he leads the Jumu'ah prayer, the Friday prayer, in the masjid of Sultan Nuruddin Zangi rahimahullah. And when he leads the prayer, he dresses up in a garb with an imama and a black garb, and he ascends the mimbar, the mimbar for the salah, what is known in English as a pulpit, but the mimbar is the correct word, and he gives a khutbah regarding mujahideen, and regarding that the mujahideen, after fighting in the way of Allah, they have declared the caliphate. That is the excitement that gave to many factions within the Al-Qaeda minded individuals, or those who are affected by Al-Qaeda ideology. There was an excitement. Of course, this issue is much more complex because, firstly, we have groups associated with Ikhwan al-Muslimin which must be disassociated from Al-Qaeda in terms of ideology and how they view politics or how they view the region. But there are also various factions. There are in fact secular factions. So currently as we speak, there are Kurds that are cooperating with the rebel takeover. Those Kurds are supported by the United States of America. So the Kurdish groups that operate within rebel held areas are actually supported by the United States of America, but are currently cooperating with the rebels who have taken Halab, or most of Halab, or whatever regions of Halab. The claim is that they have taken the citadel, which is within the middle part of Halab, as well as Al-Jami' al-Umawi, the Grand Umayyad Masjid within Halab. But Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham was formed after the disunity of all the rebel factions. There was a point in Syria when there were hundreds of rebel factions operating all against the Assad regime as well as one another. So, as I have mentioned, the three distinct positions of the ulama that were taken, many people confuse my position as being Assadist in nature, which is false. The condemnation of all regimes must be consistent. Condemnation and speaking out against all regimes that carry out torture in all its forms, as well as imprisonment of political opposition, must be condemned, whether it's from Morocco all the way to Pakistan and anywhere else in the world, whether in the Muslim majority states or in the non-Muslim majority states. Having condemned that, there is a position that views the current tribulation as exactly that which is tribulation. Now I address firstly those people who are internet warriors here in the West, who are within the Anglosphere, who speak the English language, and they address myself and others who take my view and adopt my view as being Assadists, people who glorify this violence. Those who glorify this violence do not take the guidance of the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What was the guidance of the best of creation? That the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is one body. When one part is hurt, it is as if the other part, the rest of the body, is hurt. Now, when Assad's soldiers carry out acts of oppression, that hurts all of us as Muslims. But similarly, when the rebel fighters carry out acts of oppression against Muslims, that is also hurtful to the Muslim body. But what I want to point out is that Al-Jawlani will not establish the Khilafah. Al-Jawlani, the Al-Qaeda associate, will not re-establish Al-Khilafatul Islamiyah. Not in any way different or distinct to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. In fact, their actions lead to the killing of more civilians, more innocent people. As we speak now, the Russian planes, this has given a reason now for Russian planes to carry out acts, bombardment of rebel-held areas. And some people, they attempt to compare the Palestinian resistance with the Syrian rebel groups. Now, there is no doubt that the Syrian regime has carried out historically acts of what would be deemed as acts that violate human rights, international law, or any law, whether it's Islamic law, our law, or whether it's any man-made law. There is no doubt that the Syrian regime imprisons political opposition, but the state of Syria prior to the current uprising can nowhere be deemed as being better or having improved in any way or form. Having lived in Damascus, many of the Tulab al-Ilm who studied there would know that the freedom of study, dirasa, as well as Islamic activities was more under the Assad regime than ISIS, for instance. So you had Daesh burning the books of Al-Imam Ahmad bin Zaini Dahlan, prohibiting Sunni literature, violating the freedom of Sunnis. Now I utilize the term Sunnis excluding the Wahhabis. I do not include them within Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. It is only the Wahhabis who glorified their actions, or Wahhabis who are ideologically aligned with Daesh or with Al-Qaeda. Of course, the Daesh is Al-Qaeda on steroids, and Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of Wahhabi ideology. But having said that, the Syrian rebels who were Sunnis, many of them had joined FSA, Free Syrian Army, and many of them had joined various different resistance or rebel groups or rebel factions. But those rebel factions disintegrated, and the dominant factions, the alpha factions, became those Wahhabi factions in the post-2010. That was the reality on the ground. It was after the bombardment from the sky, meaning with air power, that the movement of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi disintegrated. He was killed in some tunnels, and then the ISIS group, they announced a successor. Of course, some of the successors were killed, and to this day ISIS keeps announcing a new caliph. These are typical Khawarij group. While I mentioned the Assad regime is a typical Ba'athist regime, a secular regime, the rebel factions led by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda al-Jawlani, they would fall under typical Wahhabi leadership. What does that mean for our position? That what we observe today is fitna to Sham. What is fitna to Sham? Fitna to Sham is that both groups are guilty of having killed innocent people. The Assad regime as well as the rebel factions. And those who glorify these groups from the internet or romanticize with regard to rebellion, they are not the ones who have had their homes bombed, their families displaced, young children being charred by Russian planes. When those Russian planes carry out the bombardment, they do not discriminate whether this is a supporter of Bashar al-Assad or whether it's a Sunni or whether it's a Shi'i or whether it's a Ba'athist or whatever label people may apply to these people. Those bombs, they char young children, people who live here, and glorify rebellion, glorify taking up arms, when they do not have the clear ability to overthrow those regimes. Now, what must be made clear, we know Hezbollah is backed by Iran. Iran is the backer of Hezbollah. And similarly, Iran backs the group in Yemen known as Ansarullah and other factions. But who is backing the current Syrian rebels? That is a critical question that must be asked. How can you fight a sitting government, a government with an army, without the backing of a state? Which state is actually backing the Syrian rebels? Is it the Turkish government, a NATO ally, the Turkish government which has interests in Syria, like creating a buffer zone to allow Syrian migrants who have migrated to Turkey to return them back to Syria. So by creating a buffer zone, they return all those Syrians back to Syria, because Erdogan in his policies in the past has had no concern for human life, whether it is those policies in Libya, whether it's his policies in Iraq, where they bomb Kurdish areas, where Kurdish areas are bombed by the Turkish army, and similarly in North Syria. So is it Turkey that backs the current Syrian rebels? And previously, some of my critics online, they have said that it is a conspiracy theory to deem the current rebels as being supported in some way by what they refer to as the Israelis, by Mossad. That is not actually conspiracy. If someone done their research, they would find in the past that Syrian rebels were treated in Tel Aviv. They had treatment in Tel Aviv. So this current invasion of Halab, it comes at a time when Gaza is at a critical point. So some of the critics, they said that the rebels will act in Palestine, but they cannot currently act in Palestine because they do not share a border with what is referred to as Israel, which is absurd, because from the year 2011 to the current time, within that time period, there was sufficient time as well as expansion of Syrian rebel groups that had taken control of regions that neighbored what is referred to as Israel. In reality, it is occupied Palestine. And these rebel groups did not act against the Israeli occupation or the Jewish occupation of Palestine. They did not act against them. So how to interpret that is that these mercenaries, some of these mercenaries, we do not know who actually pays them, who pays their wages. These mercenaries acting out in Syria, as they did post-Daesh, many of them, if you remember, Daesh was at one stage, their mercenaries were robbing banks. They even demolished historical graves, like the grave of Sayyidina Ammar bin Yasir radiyallahu anh, the companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is buried in Raqqa. They placed explosives on the entire shrine and blew it up. Of course, Wahhabis will have no problem with that. But that is deeply offensive to the Sunni Muslims, to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that this is a violation of our history and our historical sites. But they gave total disregard to this because they claimed that they were spreading Tawheed. And of course, historically, this is how Wahhabism actually spread within the Arabian Peninsula. Historically, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and the three waves of Wahhabism, or the three waves of the Saudi family within the Arabian Peninsula, they spread through violence and through the sword. They would not spread through debate or munaqasha ilmiyah. They only spread through actual violence. So as we speak now, there are current updates. I will read up some of the updates. But prior to doing that, I will take some of your questions from critics alike and respond to you, insha'Allah ta'ala. Someone asks, do Donma Jews rule Turkey? Now the Donma is in reference to the followers of a Jewish Messiah from 1666 who took refuge in Ottoman territory, in the Ottoman Caliphate. And they settled mainly in Salonika. It is claimed that Ataturk was a descendant of these Donma Jews. Someone asks, with regard to the hadith, لعن الله اليهود والنصارى اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجدا. So, with regard to this, he asks that Allah cursed the Jews and Christians that they took the graves of the prophets as places of worship. This means salah is prohibited behind a grave. You cannot do sajda towards a grave. You cannot do ruku' to a grave. This is totally prohibited. If there is a grave, it must be covered where people cannot approach the grave for ibadah. That is the meaning of the hadith. Someone asks, do you think this is an opportunity for Israel to take Syria? What they refer to as Israel is not actually powerful enough to expand itself because they do not have the sufficient manpower. But what this does is further weakens the pathway that by which arms was supplied to Lebanon. So the pathway from Iraq gave, if Russia or Iran supplied arms towards resistance groups in Lebanon, the pathway to that was via Damascus. And this weakens that line of supplying weapons. So it is only in Benjamin Netanyahu's interests that Syria be weakened. Someone asks, they ask, are these groups Sunni? Now the answer is that Al-Jawlani is not from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He is Wahhabi, he is Najdi. But there are Sunni rebels involved. There are Syrians who are Sunni because the default group in Bilad al-Sham is Sunni. But there are many foreign Wahhabi fighters who lead the way, and they are the most aggressive from all the groups, and they dominate all the rebel groups. Someone asks with regard to Izzuddin al-Qassam, rahimahullah, he was a resistance fighter that was shaheed in the mid-1930s, and in fact he took fatwa from Al-Imam Badruddin al-Hassani, rahimahullah. So someone asks with regard to these groups that you have mentioned, why don't they fight Israel? And I did mention this. Many of their trolls attempt to respond to that by saying that they have no border with what they refer to as Israel. But the reality is, in the past, they have had a border, and to this day, none of those fighters entered Lebanon, for instance. And surprisingly, with regard to what they refer to as the white helmets, there was no real presence of the white helmets in Lebanon. Suddenly, now that events are unfolding in Halab, the white helmets have reappeared. So these white helmets that claim to be humanitarian groups that count the casualties, they resurface in Syria, but they never show themselves in Lebanon. Why I mention Lebanon is because we can accede the point that they cannot enter Gaza, but they are nowhere to be seen in Lebanon. Someone asks the question, why are the Muslim countries not doing anything for the Palestinians in Gaza? What can they do to get a ceasefire in Gaza? Well, with regard to inactivity of the Muslim regimes with regard to Gaza, it relates to two things. One of them is finance, and finance in the sense that all of them are intertwined with the international banking system and international finance in terms of being tied up to the IMF and the World Bank, as well as military aid from Western countries that actually back the Israeli occupation. Someone says, you say greater Israel won't be achieved, but all current events support its pathway. It may seem like that to you, but currently as we speak, it has been 14 months, nearly 14 months. And what you refer to as Israel cannot even take a strip of land, which is known as Gaza. It is unable to take a strip of land. And the resistance remains. The resistance has not been extinguished. So the attempt to create a greater Israel is underway. But will it be achieved? Or will these events lead to the coming of the Sufyani and the appearance of the Euphrates gold? Someone asks, should we support the rebel fighters? If you look at the history of these rebel fighters, they are led by Jawlani. Jawlani has a criminal history from the inception of the Syrian revolution and the uprising against Bashar al-Assad. And ideologically, we do not align. We do not align with Bashar, we do not align with Jawlani. These are groups of fitna, groups of tribulation. Someone asks, when Islamic scriptures refer to Yahud, do modern day ethnic Jews who are atheists, for example, fall within this category? Also, the difference between those referred to as Banu Israel and Yahud would not affect the above statement. Sometimes the terms, so every Bani Israel is not a Yahudi, because there are some Bani Israel that became Muslim. Bani Israel therefore refers to an ethnic group, people who are descendants of Yaqub alayhi salam. But some of the Bani Israel adopted what is Yahud, al-Yahudiyya, which is Judaism, which is an ideology. So we utilize the term al-Yahudi for anyone who adopts the ideology of al-Yahudiyya, which is recognized now as a religion. But the term Bani Israel refers to an ethnic group, some of whom adopted Islam. But when the Quran addresses Bani Israel in a condemnatory way, it refers to those Bani Israel who had adopted al-Yahudiyya as an ideology. Someone asked the question that Erdogan did not send any troops to help Palestine, but then sends troops and backed many groups in Syria's current situation. That is the nature of nation states, that nation states are formed in a way to protect their own interests. They do not protect the interests of Islam as a whole or as an ummah as a whole. Meaning, if there was a Khalifa, the Khalifa would protect the interests of the entire ummah. But Erdogan, unfortunately, is not a sultan and is not the Khalifa. So therefore, Erdogan will protect the interests of secular Turkey, which entails creating a buffer zone within Bilad al-Sham so he can, because they failed miserably in toppling Bashar al-Assad. And the Kurds are active within northern Syria and northern Iraq. So it only falls within the interests of Turkey to make a buffer zone so many Syrians who are pro-revolution can return back to their homes. But what we want in the long run is peace and security. So some people think that's being an Assadist. That is not being an Assadist. If the rebels can provide peace and security, that would be a desirable outcome. But the historical track record of the rebel groups has been not to have security in that region. Someone says, Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh, the scenario you explained, then who are the right regime in Syria? And how does it impact end of times and the arrival of Al-Mahdi? Well, firstly, currently speaking in the world, in the Muslim majority countries, we would not support any of the regimes. We do not support any one of the regimes, because all these regimes have an absurd human rights abuse record. They do not respect the human being. And Sayyidina Ali radiallahu an, he said in a hadith narrated from him, meaning a mawquf hadith, that, and the hadith that are related by a Sahabi concerning the end of times generally are deemed as marfu'. He states that in the end of times there will come a time when if a person says Allah, Allah, he will be killed. That is the time we live in. That if a Syrian imprisoned in a Syrian jail is tortured to the point, and I know this from first-hand accounts, that if they mention Allah, it enrages their torturer. And it is no different in Egypt. It is no different in many of the regimes that rule the Muslim majority world. How does it prepare for Al-Mahdi? That Al-Mahdi will not appear until حَتَّى إِذَا مُلِئَتِ الْأَرْضُ ظُلْمًا وَجَوْرًا, until the earth is filled with oppression and tyranny. And that is what we are observing. Someone states, many people who claim science and Orthodox Sunnism are praising the groups in Syria as if they are akin to Salahuddin al-Ayyubi or Nuruddin al-Zangi rahimahumullah. They are not akin to Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahimahullah. In fact, these groups are akin to Khawarij. And I do not say Khawarij in relation to Bashar al-Assad. I mean it in the sense that they kill civilians, innocent people. No different to any killing that may have occurred under Bashar al-Assad. What is your opinion on Tahrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, which are targeting Muslims in Pakistan? Do you deem them as Khawarij? Again, any group that targets civilians is deemed as Khawarij, whether it refers to itself as Tahrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan. And at the same time, we must be very clear in our condemnation of any regime that shoots at civilians. So the Pakistani police that shoots at protesters, whether those protesters are TLP or PTI or any other group, no regime should be firing at civilians who are unarmed. No soldier or police officer has the right to shoot down unarmed civilians, whether that is Bashar al-Assad, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, any regime. And that is consistency in position. I make that very clear. But similarly, no group has the right to kill civilians, whether that is what is referred to as freedom groups in Pakistan, claiming to want freedom from the Pakistani regime, or whether it's freedom groups in Syria. That is consistency in position. Someone asks, is current situation in Syria will lead to the emergence of Sufyani, and sanctions on Syria and Iraq occurred, but we didn't see similar sanctions in Egypt. We did observe the sanctions in Iraq from the year 1990, when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. Post 1990, sanctions were imposed on Iraq. It took over many years for the sanctions to increase on Bilad Sham and Syria. So post 1990, within the past 34 years, Sham has come, meaning Greater Syria, has come to the position that it is in today, which is the devastation of Lebanon, the devastation of Palestine, the devastation of Syria, the Muhafadat, the various cities in Syria. That took 34 years. Gaza and the Rafah crossing, these are regions, or the Sinai, these regions are linked to Egypt. There are current sanctions on the crossing, the border from Egypt to Bilad Sham. The increase of sanctions is a sign that we will observe in the near future. As for the current events leading to the appearance of Sufyani, that is only known by Allah, that is ghaib. But if the sign of the Euphrates gold appears suddenly, because the signs appear baghtatan, baghtatan means suddenly, when you are unexpecting them. You could wake up one morning and the Euphrates gold appears in the Euphrates, meaning the Euphrates uncovers a mountain of gold. That can happen baghtatan, suddenly. But will the current situation lead to the rise of the Sufyani? What I can say with certainty, that is Al-Jawlani will not restore the caliphate. And anyone who believes that Al-Jawlani and his band of rebels will actually emancipate Palestine, they are living in a dream. When they enter Damascus, in Damascus we have historical sites like Bab Saghir. We have many historical places within Damascus. If they ever enter Damascus, their position towards many of the historical sites in that historical city will be observed by the world. But the track record of these rebels has not been a good track record, and they should not be glorified. The current war should not be romanticized. Similarly, Bashar al-Assad should not be made out to be a man of justice, as some people attempt to model him as a man of justice or a man who is a man of credibility. None of them have credibility. But what we want for all Muslim countries is security and peace. For Muslims to thrive, to have security and peace, and security and peace is better than the current war. As for those who glorify the current war on Twitter, on YouTube, on social media, glorify the rebels, they do not deem those children that die in these wars as their own children, or they do not view them as the way they would view their own children. Someone asks, isn't rebelling against Bashar al-Assad the dog the same as rebelling against a taghut? The answer is that the condition of rebelling is overthrowing the regime. That condition is not met. Secondly, the leadership should be known. The current leadership is under Al-Jawlani. But prior to what is known as Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham, in 2011, the leadership was totally unknown. And thirdly, where are the rebels gaining their support? Who supports them? Who has interests in the region? Who will benefit from the destabilization of what is known as Syria. So, Taghut does not only apply to Bashar al-Assad, it applies to many of those regimes in that region. But no one is calling for an overthrow of the surrounding governments, whether that be the Jordanian government, which is an ally of Western powers in defending what is known as Israel. The Jordanian government, no one has called for an overthrow of the Jordanian regime. No one has entered Jordan in the way that they have entered Syria. Why is Syria being specified? Or why was the situation in Syria post 2011 taken advantage of, and we observe now the current situation where things have escalated? Someone asks, so the Quran and Hadith are not referring to ethnic Jews who are often atheists, like Netanyahu and Theodore Herzl. The answer is that the Quran does refer to them, because they make disparaging the Al-Yahud that were referred to. Many of them would have atheistic positions, and many of them would also curse God and say certain things. Additionally, Benjamin Netanyahu is actually a messianic Jew. He believes in the messianic prophecies. And those Jews who claim to be secular and atheist and support Zionism and support the what they refer to as Israel, they actually believe in a Messiah. They hold a strong view with regard to a Messiah. Someone asks if there is such a thing as a fifth madhab, and is it Salafism? The answer is no. There are only four Sunni schools. Someone asks, I've read that in the Hanafi madhab and in most other madhahib, the graves should not be taller than a hand's length. Why are all the Sufi graves taller than that when they were mostly Hanafi? The answer is that it is makruh in the Hanafi school to raise a grave above a shibr, what they refer to as a shibr, and some state dhira, which is an arm's length. Having said that, if someone is a mutawalli, a custodian of a grave, and he's meaning it's deemed disliked to have the grave raised above the ground to such a height, the custodian of the grave is, when he carries out the change of the grave, does he place dynamites on the grave and blow up the top of the grave? When the Prophet ﷺ prohibits people from sitting on a grave or walking on a grave because it harms the denizens of the grave. Therefore, the construction must be carried out in a humane fashion. Secondly, it's permitted to have four walls constructed around a grave. That is permitted, even in the Hanafi school. So you check works like Ahkam al-Janaiz within the Hanafi school, you will find the permissibility of constructing a room around a grave of a person who is of Islamic value, like a Sahabi or a Tabi'i or Atba'u Tabi'in or the great A'imma, that you can construct a room and even a restroom for people to come and visit the grave. This is found in the Hanafi school in works like Ahkam al-Janaiz. Someone says, Sheikh, please raise awareness about Indian occupied Kashmir. Insha'Allah ta'ala, we will cover this in a live stream in the future, in the near future, with regard to the situation in Kashmir. Someone asks, when did these groups kill the civilians? Well, you need to look into the historical trajectory of these groups from the year 2011. Go and research Al-Jawlani, who leads the current Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham. Study Awad Ibrahim, who is known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Read intricate and detailed works that have been written on the Syrian situation from 2011, and you will find the history of the killings that have occurred due to the events in Syria. Someone asks, why has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given strength to Israel? The answer to your question should be, the reason is the weakness of our Iman. Imagine if there was one Sahabi alive today, the strength of Iman of one Sahabi. How would that Sahabi respond to the Jewish occupation of Palestine? That is the strength of Iman of a Sahabi. So the weakness of our Iman gives us the false image that the Jewish occupation has strength and power. Someone asks with regard to how sound are the Hadith and Sufyani. Well, individual Hadith regarding the Sufyani and specifying the Sufyani are actually weak. But Hadith that refer to the Sufyani or implicate the Sufyani are actually authentic, like the Hadith in Bukhari. There is a Hadith in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari which mentions that a leader of Ash-Sham, Bilad al-Sham, will dispatch an army to apprehend Al-Mahdi in Makkah al-Mukarramah. Because the people of Al-Madinah al-Munawwarah in that time will support Al-Mahdi, the army of this leader of Bilad al-Sham at that time will enter the city of Al-Madinah al-Munawwarah. He will ransack, violate the sanctity of the city and pillage the city, and then his army will make head towards Makkah al-Mukarramah. They will reach a region which is known as Al-Bayda, which currently, if you view from Google Maps, you will know that it is quicksand. They will reach that region and the army will be swallowed. Two people will survive, one to inform the Mahdi with regard to the outcome of that army, and the other person will go to the leader of Sham to inform him. Al-Mahdi will later enter Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, and that leader will be defeated. This leader that is implied is the leader known as Sufyani. And this particular hadith is in the Sahih of Imam Al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, and would be deemed as the most authentic hadith regarding him. As for the Sufyani, one detail that is mentioned regarding him is that he is actually from Banu Kalb. Banu Kalb is a tribe that the current Bashar al-Assad family belongs to. That the Sufyanis, أخواله من كلب, which means his maternal relatives are from Kalb. So Bashar al-Assad belongs to Bani Kalb, but the maternal relatives of the Sufyani will be from Bani Kalb. So that means that the Sufyani will have maternal relatives within Bani Kalb, which is the actual tribe of Bashar al-Assad. That doesn't mean Bashar al-Assad is actually the Sufyani. But events will unfold in a way that no one is able to predict the future. We can only rely upon the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who did not predict. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not predict the future, he gave prophecy, because it is wahyun yuha, it is revelation sent to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَمَا يَنطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not speak from his desires. It is only wahy that is sent and is free from error. So as we discuss the current regime, the Bashar al-Assad regime, of course, Hafiz al-Assad came into power within the Ba'ath Party post 1970. And someone asks, I'm confused, I'm new to this, who is Sufyani? Sufyani is a tyrant that will arise in the future, preceding the events of Al-Imam al-Mahdi. And some have said that he will have a role to play when the Euphrates gold will be uncovered. The Euphrates gold is a gold that will be uncovered under the Euphrates, an event yet to happen. But as I was saying, that Bashar al-Assad, his father Hafiz al-Assad, he came to power in the year 1970. Prior to him, 3 years prior to him, there was the first Arab, what they refer to as the second Arab-Israeli war, because if you count the events of 1948, there was the Nakba, when the Palestinians, over 700,000 of them, were forcefully removed from Palestine. But then in 1967, there is what is referred to as the Arab-Israeli war. In that war, the Syrians lost the Golan Heights. And remember, the Arabs were led by secular regimes. So Gamal Abdel Nasser was a socialist, Arab nationalist. He had a successful encounter against British, Israeli Jewish and French forces that attempted to invade the Suez Canal for their own interests. Remember, the Suez Canal is a man-made canal. A man-made canal that was constructed under Disraeli, the first British Jewish Prime Minister, who gave Queen Victoria the epithet of the Empress of India. And of course, even Benjamin Disraeli identified himself as a Jew and had some interesting comments to make with regard to what became known as Zionism. But nevertheless, when they attempted to subdue the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s, he defeated them, and there was the famous intervention of the United States of America. But in 1967, the Arab regimes failed miserably, and the Golan Heights, which is known as Golan, which is what Jawlani claims to be from, by referring to himself as Al-Jawlani, meaning the Golan Heights. These Golan Heights are the snowy mountains on the border of what is known as Syria today. They are occupied by the Jewish occupational forces. The Golan was the area from where Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah radiyallahu anhu entered Bilad al-Sham. That was the passageway from where he conquered Palestine. That region has been under occupation, and there are some Arab traitors from that region, like the Druze and others, Bedouins, who support the current Israeli occupation. It is from that region that some of the Syrian rebels were being taken into what is known as Israel, which is actually occupied Palestine, and being treated by Tel Aviv, by the Jewish occupation. Why? Because it suits their interests. It does not matter to the Jewish occupation of Palestine whether someone is a Sunni or a Shia. What is in their interest is a disintegration, a balkanization of the region, a separation of all areas, making Syria into factions. So how they would want, ideally, is the north be given, for instance, to the Kurds, especially the northeast. Ladikia be given to the Nusayris and the coastal region. And then Halab be given to the Sunnis alongside perhaps with the Damascus. That is a division of Syria. When you have a balkanization of the region, a disintegration of the region, it strengthens the region, the garrison fort, which is known as the State of Israel. It strengthens their position in the region. It strengthens American interests in the region. So disintegration of Muslim countries, like what is occurring in Sudan, which the UAE has a secret hand, the breaking up of Sudan, or the attempt to break up different countries, only suits the interest of that garrison fort, which is attempting to create what is known as a greater Israel. So supporting rebel factions, whether it be in Pakistan, whether it be in Syria or anywhere else, only falls into the interests of governments that are antithetical to Islam and antithetical to the Muslims. Having said that, these regimes do not help their own cause. Whether it be the Pakistani army firing at civilians, or whether it be Bashar al-Assad firing at civilians, shooting down civilians, or bombarding Halab, as is claimed by barrel bombs, but there is a level of propaganda also. There is a level of propaganda. So propaganda against the regimes is also utilized by those who have an interest in supporting rebel groups. As we speak now, there was a claim that the rebel groups have actually occupied Hama. And then later on, the regime reveals that Hama is not actually occupied. Similarly, videos are being released displaying acts of violence against people which are despicable, and then we do not know whether the context of those videos is real or not. For instance, there is a video purporting that the Halab rebels capture a soldier from the Assad army, and then the soldier reads out the kalimatu shahada, la ilaha illallah, Sayyiduna Muhammadur Rasulullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He recites the testimony of faith, but they behead him. Now, what is the context of that? That is not clear. Is it from the current events, or is it from the past 15 years? Because these tumultuous events have been occurring for the past 15 years. In that time, a child who was born in 2010 would be 15 years old now, and not having any memory bank with regard to what has actually been occurring. So what should our position be in Akhirul Zaman, in this day and age of fitan, tribulations, is not to take up arms against Muslims. The hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam warned Muslims about taking up arms against fellow Muslims. Now some people will say Bashar al-Assad is not a Muslim, but what cannot be denied is that many of his soldiers are Muslims. The army consists of a huge faction of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and taking up arms against one another, whether that be in Pakistan, or whether that be in Syria, or anywhere else within the Muslim majority countries, taking up arms would be prohibited. Killing fellow Muslims would be prohibited. Killing non-Muslims, non-combatant non-Muslims would be prohibited. the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned areas where legitimate jihad would be occurring. There is a legitimate jihad, a struggle, a fight for liberation in what is known as Palestine. But when it comes to inter-Muslim rebel groups or regimes, there is a disintegration of Muslim society, a destruction, a nature of self-destruction, where people are taking up hammers against themselves. And that, of course, is motivated by foreign powers for the interests of NATO and other groups. Inshallah ta'ala, I will be taking some additional questions and then we'll be analyzing some of the updates from the current events in Bilad al-Sham. Someone asks, with regard to a certain sheikh who praised the Christian Pope, is there an explanation for this? The answer is the person who has done it would need to explain for themselves. Someone asks, Sheikh, would you acknowledge that Al-Imam Al-Bouti may have been wrong on anti-rebellion? Oppression is oppression, regardless of whether the oppressor is a foreign occupier or an internal tyrant. I would advise you to refer to the clips of Al-Bouti, rahimahullah ta'ala, where he clearly condemns the oppression of the regime. Those clips are never advertised by his detractors. His detractors never display the videos where he instructs the Syrian army to make tawbah from oppression. Those videos are found online on his official channel. Someone asks, Assalamu alaikum Shaykh, why are you living in Europe? I'm living in Britain because I was born here. I do not have any other citizenship. If you can provide me kindly with a Saudi passport, I would happily live in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah or perhaps Makkah Al-Mukarramah. So if I had a Saudi passport, I would live in the Haramain. Thank you very much. Someone asks, is it better for the Syrian rebels or Assad to be in power? The response to that would be, whoever gives a state of stability. Stability is the key. The way we would want to live in stability, or we would want our families to live in stability, we would want the Syrians to have stability. So whoever provides stability is the lesser evil. Someone asks, I asked Shaykh, earlier you said any group that attacks civilians is Khawarij. But by this logic, was na'udhu billah, he doesn't say na'udhu billah, I say, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam a Khariji because he allowed collaterals during a night raid? The answer is there is a difference between giving oversight to collateral damage, where the target is a military target, as opposed to making civilians a legitimate target. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam attacked forts which are defended by military. The forts were defended by military. People posted to defend a fort. And then when it was discovered that there was what people refer to as collateral, that was not the purposeful target. The Khawarij we have today, they wear suicide straps and bomb a market. So in what occurred in Iraq for many years under Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was the precursor to Awad Ibrahim, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They led suicide missions in markets where the people in the markets were Muslims. Someone asks, which sharh commentary for the book of Al-Imam al-Tahawi do you recommend? In English, Babarti's commentary has been translated by Amal Press. Sheikh Amjad Mahmood has already translated Babarti's commentary. Someone says, what do you think of Ismail Anwar Pasha? Anwar Pasha was a part of the faction that overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid, the group that was known as the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress. In 1908, they conspired to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid under the pretext that he should restore the constitution, which he had suspended. And Anwar Pasha then led the Ottoman Caliphate, or what was left of it, into World War I, a critical mistake in which millions of Muslims were martyred. They were led into war against Russia and then later against Western allies when the Ottomans under Anwar Pasha aligned with Germany. Later, Anwar Pasha perished in Central Asia, and then there was the leadership of Ataturk subsequently. Someone asks the question, what's the ruling regarding suicide bombing, often referred to as martyrdom missions by Hamas? The answer is Hamas has discarded this practice. This practice was introduced in the Muslim world by the Iranians when they fought the regime of Saddam Hussein. It was then imported into Syria during that time, and from Syria it entered the Palestinian resistance. It was adopted by some of the Palestinian resistance, most specifically an individual they refer to as Al-Muhandis in the 1990s, who carried out suicide bombings wearing a suicide vest at that time. This policy was not officially condoned by Sheikh Yassin. But then the new leadership of Hamas post 2005, they abandoned this practice. Generally speaking, suicide bombing would be prohibited because it goes against the maqasid, the objectives of the Sharia, which is protection of life, and suicide bombing would not be permitted. Someone says, Shaykh, you once said that Indian Muslims should support Pakistan. Do you still hold this view? Indian Muslims who support Modi are misguided. You cannot support Modi. You cannot support an ultra extreme Hindu regime of Modi. Modi is a killer. Modi is a tyrant who occupies our homeland of origin, which is Kashmir. May Allah free Kashmir from the tyrant Hindu government, and no Muslim should support Modi. The Muslims in India should unite amongst themselves, all the factions, and have a strong presence, a Muslim bloc within the Indian democratic process. They should have a presence within Indian politics and drive Modi out of power. Shame on those Muslims who support Modi. Shame on those Sufi sheikhs, so-called Sufi sheikhs, who support Modi. You do not represent Tasawwuf. Some of them were condemning Shaykh Ramadan Al-Bouti in Syria. Some of them condemned Shaykh Ramadan Al-Bouti in Syria when his stance was nuanced. He was safeguarding the Syrians. And then they gave excuse for Indians who support Modi, saying they are safeguarding Muslims, which is not the case. Muslims in India could form a bloc and align themselves with other less aggressive politicians. So Muslims in India do not have a reason to be anti-Pakistan. In fact, there are some Indian Muslims who are misguided to the point they call for jihad against Pakistan. That is a misguided view, totally misguided. It calls for inter-Muslim war. Anything that leads to insurrection and disintegration of Muslim power and Muslim presence is a sign of misguidance. Whether that's from a regime, an army, or a rebel faction, that is the rule that I follow. Someone asks, can we go to Damascus in order to study? The answer is currently Damascus would be shut off for study. One Palestinian says, I prefer Assad as a Palestinian Syrian. Well, many will disagree with you, but whoever provides safety for the people at this point would be preferable, or is the lesser evil. Someone asks, Sheikh, when will Friday tafsir resume? Please answer. The answer is that we do tafsir al-Qurtubi from 8 o'clock till 9 o'clock every Friday. Someone says, but Assad is not even a Muslim. It took them 50 years to realize that. So in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, even into the 2000s, the late Shaykh Yusuf al-Qardawi visited Syria. He did not declare Bashar a kafir because ostensibly Bashar practices Islam, mainstream Islam, and has abandoned Nusayri faith. What is in his heart, Allah knows best. But it took them that long to realize that, to validate the Syrian rebellion. Someone says, Sheikh, could you please tell us about if occupying, conquering Aleppo is a good thing? Are the rebels on the right side? Why are some Muslims celebrating and others are against it? Those who are celebrating it are those who supported the uprising against Bashar al-Assad in 2011, and those who are against it are those who realize that there are other forces supporting the Syrian rebels at this stage in order to achieve political objectives. Someone asks, Sheikh, do you still support Pakistan as a state? The response to you is that I do not believe in insurrection, armed insurrection, if it leads to further bloodshed. The only solution is that elements within the army itself must carry out that insurrection, a bloodless coup. So if there is any standing army, like the army of Pakistan, and there are upright soldiers who are within the high echelons of power of the Pakistani military, they have the obligation of carrying out a bloodless coup d'etat. And a similar solution would apply to many of the regimes, whether that includes Egypt or Syria. Someone states, are all uprisings against tyrants not allowed? As I stated, that in the case where it leads to further bloodshed, in these days of Ayyam al-Fitan, tribulation, our target must be safeguarding Muslims and not obeying those people who, some of them on Twitter, they use Khattab, who was Khattab was from Arabia, and he fought in Chechnya and Dagestan. They utilize his picture, romanticizing as if they are Khattab, which they are not, sitting in the Western world, and then glorifying and romanticizing what is occurring in Syria, not knowing that there are children being orphaned, families that are disintegrated, breakup of families, the destruction of family homes, and in fact the destruction of entire cities has occurred. Someone asks, why does Birmingham have so many Ajib Muslim groups? Because Birmingham is the Baghdad of the West. We have strange movements within Birmingham. But inshallah, the Ash'aris will dominate as usual. A Christian asks, do Muslims live in Israel? Well, you need to understand that what you refer to as Israel is occupied Muslim land. So those Muslims have been living there previous to the European occupation. Benjamin Netanyahu is not even Semitic. He is as Semitic as you are. He's Polish. He's not Semitic. So he's occupying that land by force. Someone asks, do you still support Pakistan? I don't mean the current rulers, I mean Pakistan as a state. Like how many ulama support Pakistan. I support the concept of Greater Pakistan, which is Khilafah. What does that mean? It means the emancipation of the entire Kashmir. It means the conquering of Delhi. It means the reunification of what is known as Bangladesh with what is, and all the land in between, with a Greater Pakistan. Is that possible in the current context? The answer is no, because both nationalistic states are nuclear powers. It can only occur through a remodification of the thought processes of the people of that region, or it will happen in Ghazwatul Hind. Will Ghazwatul Hind occur at the hands of the Pakistani army? The answer is no. Is Pakistan Khurasan? The answer is no. Khurasan is west Afghanistan and east Iran. That is Khurasan. The army of Khurasan will arrive in the time of Al-Mahdi. Who will carry out Ghazwatul Hind? Al-Mahdi will carry out Ghazwatul Hind. Those events have not occurred. They will occur in the future. But do I believe in the Republic of Pakistan? The answer is no. What I believe in is Greater Pakistan, which is what I mentioned, the entire Kashmir, Delhi, all the way to what is known as Bangladesh should be all under the Greater Pakistan, which in fact is the Khilafah. Someone asks, Shaykh, who killed a Shaykh Ramadan Al-Bouti, the regime or the rebels? The best people to ask that question would be his grandson and son in Damascus. Inshallah, we will read some of the updates from the occurrences, the current occurrences within Syria. I will read some of the updates and then analyze these updates as to what is actually occurring on the ground. So some of the live updates, what they mention is rebels with the group Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham have seized control of large parts of Aleppo, one of Syria's largest cities, after a surprise offensive this week. Now, with regard to this, as I mentioned, the history of Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham is the reorganization and rebranding of Al-Qaeda in Syria. But does it include what they refer to as more moderate groups? That is the term utilized by Westerners. The Westerners, the pro-NATO Western nations, they may sometimes utilize the term as moderates, what they refer to as moderates. It does include them. And this Hay'atu Tahrir al-Sham is led by Al-Jawlani. Now, Al-Jawlani did release a statement which I will be analyzing shortly. We will be analyzing the statement of Al-Jawlani which were guidelines to what they referred to as mujahideen. What the updates state, the renewed fighting in Aleppo marks a new phase in Syria's long-running civil war, which began in 2011 during the Arab Spring protests. Now, this term, Arab Spring, is a false term. It should be called the Arab Winter, because a winter occurred post this Arab Spring. You had Al-Mursi, rahimahullah, being killed by Abdul Fattah Sisi. So the people of Egypt, after the protests in Tahrir Square, which led to the fall of Hosni al-Mubarak, who has passed away also, it led to the elections within Egypt. And the elections, the people of Egypt, they elected Al-Mursi. But the American-backed, the US-backed army carried out a coup d'etat, and currently the leader Abdul Fattah Sisi was placed, and many of the supporters of Al-Mursi were killed in their thousands. Many thousands and tens of thousands were imprisoned. That was a result of what they refer to as the Arab Spring. Similarly, in Libya, NATO carries out airstrikes, and in that time Britain was ruled, of course these rulers are dummies in the driving seat, the actual policies are drawn out for them. But we had David Cameron and his government that supported NATO strikes, airstrikes on positions against the late Colonel Gaddafi. There were false rumors that Gaddafi's forces were carrying out human rights abuses and a genocide, supposed genocide. Now, they refuse to use the word genocide for Gaza today, but they refer to what Gaddafi was doing as a genocide. And based on that false and remember, this doesn't make someone a pro-Gaddafi. And this is what people need to understand. Those who refer to us as Assadists or pro-Assad, they need to understand a critical analysis of any interests of foreign governments in toppling a regime does not entail being pro that regime. So Gaddafi was toppled by a NATO government, and the rebels were backed, and they were supposedly Islamic, similar to these rebels in Syria. But what did these so-called Islamic rebels do? When they capture Gaddafi, they torture him and they abuse him in ways that are unspoken. Go and carry out your research on what they did to Colonel Gaddafi. Un-Islamic, because even if you capture the worst of people, you are not permitted to torture him. But these NATO-backed rebels, supposedly Islamic individuals with beards, utilizing Islamic phrases, they carried out many un-Islamic practices. That led to the disintegration of Libya. Today, Libya is exploited by nations like the United Arab Emirates that exploits the Libyan situation, purchasing land, carrying out construction, removal of people from their homes and lands. All of this is carried out by the ally of Israel, what is referred to as Israel, which is known as the United Arab Emirates. So this Arab Spring was no spring, it was a winter. And in Tunisia, similarly, when people toppled the regime in Tunisia, today we have complete secularism in Tunisia. There are many secular laws in Tunisia. It was not an Islamic uprising. The same has occurred in Syria. What makes the dynamics of Syria worse is that Syria neighbors Palestine, occupied Palestine. And because of this dynamic, the Western powers have an interest in the fall of Bashar and having a puppet regime within Damascus. What is mentioned is that Russia has responded to the rebel offensive with airstrikes through its though its military resources are expected to be stretched thin due to its continuing war in Ukraine. And this was expected, meaning the rebels cannot hold onto any land without heavy military support. And heavy military support includes tanks, includes air power. Without air power, you cannot hold the territory that you have gained. They have not acquired any lessons. No Western nation, that includes Turkey, will intervene for the rebels. They will not intervene directly. They will not carry out airstrikes on Bashar al-Assad. Without air power, without air cover, the civilians of Syria will suffer. Because when Russia carries out its indiscriminate targeting of rebel-held areas, there will be many civilians suffering, whether those civilians support the rebels or whether they support Bashar al-Assad. What is also mentioned, the forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had previously held Aleppo with the support of allies Iran, Russia and Lebanon's Hezbollah, and of course Hezbollah being weakened in Lebanon, and Iran reaching a point where Iran cannot strike openly. That having reached this point, it was prime time or the right time for the rebels, when Iran has reached this impasse, for the rebels to strike and take Halab. But the elation that supporters of Al-Qaeda ideology are displaying on social media is similar to the elation that was demonstrated during the occupation of Mosul. That when ISIS occupied Mosul, people were jubilant, but it entailed more suffering for the people of Mosul and for the people of Syria in Raqqa and other regions. What is mentioned is that the renewed fighting in Aleppo marks a new phase in Syria's long-running civil war, which began in 2011 during the Arab Spring protests. But what is important here is rumors sometimes dominate narrative in Syria. The fact is that with few independent journalists on the ground in Syria, unfounded rumors sometimes dominate the narrative. Example of that: did the Syrian rebels enter the city of Hama? This is false. But are opposition fighters really going missing at the hands of sleeper cells in Aleppo, as some accounts on social media have claimed? When did al-Assad return from Russia and how? So conflicting accounts make it difficult to discern reality from propaganda. In the fog of war, even blatantly false reports sometimes spread online. For instance, there is a rumor now that al-Jawlani has been killed, and this needs to be verified. So that is an update that perhaps is a rumor. Similarly, there was a rumor that a Russian plane has departed from Damascus, and people speculated that plane is Bashar al-Assad fleeing Damascus. In the past, for example, rumors about al-Assad and his brother Mahir, and this Mahir is a tyrant, Mahir al-Assad. He is a tyrant. Like Bashar. Bashar is also a tyrant. I say this unequivocally. And I have been saying this from the inception. Yes, these are tyrants. They are Jababira. The Hadith mentions these Jababira. But my position advocates for the well-being and safety of Bilad al-Sham. It is only the Wahhabi opposition, they do not like me for other reasons, for creedal issues. Because you failed on creedal issues, being unable to tackle me semantically, being unable to deal with me through kalam, you resort to false propaganda. So, in the past, for example, rumors about Al-Assad and his brother Mahir or opposition leaders being killed in the conflict made the rounds. Similarly, there are economists, a Syrian political economist who took part in the Arab Spring that ultimately sparked the country's civil war, so-called Arab Spring. It was a winter, in fact. So one of them, an economist, is quoted as saying, this is an Arab economist, it's difficult not to feel jubilant with the recent developments. And he says, he tells Al Jazeera, I'm actually very happy to see the statues of the Assad regime, the photos of Bashar al-Assad being taken down. And I would say, similarly, it's absurd how Arab regimes construct statues and have pictures everywhere and insecurity. Those statues should be taken down, and rightly so. But he states, so you understand from this that there is much more complexity. And in order to understand complexity, the written form is better than pictures and videos. So many of you watch pictures and videos or even listen to audio, but you do not bother reading written text, which helps us to understand complexity. There is much more complexity at hand than our so-called Wahhabi ideologues would want us to believe. So he states, but I must also admit that all of this is starting to subside and I'm growing increasingly scared. Yes, because these people like Jawlani cannot govern. They do not govern through stability. They govern through sectarianism. They govern through discrimination. They govern through destruction of buildings and religious sites and other acts of violence. He states he still had extended family members in the city, and he, like many Aleppo residents, was uncertain about what would happen in the coming days. And as well as this, the Syrian regime, the Syrian government, responded with heavy-handed force to opposition incursions. So what will happen now? The Syrian regime, even though it rebuilds these cities, it carries out incursions that are heavy-handed. He states, after 14 years of conflict, 14 years, that's a message for these people who romanticize these conflicts. 14 years of conflict. World War II itself was only 6 years. And even then, 1939 was a year of peace, relative peace in Britain. World War I was 4 years. Yet this extended war within Syria has been 14 years. And the current incursion into Halab will elongate the entire war. So these rebels who glorify and romanticize the current conflict, they do not, those who are on social media and living in the West, they do not live those conflict zones. They just encourage it online. So he states the Russian forces have actually already started bombing some parts of the city. And if we learned anything from the reaction of the regime and its allies when the rebels were in control of the eastern part of the city, it is that they have no problem flattening the whole city. People should learn from the past, but they have not. I give excuse to some of the trolls who troll me on Twitter that perhaps you are children under the age of 20 or perhaps under the age of 25. that you have no experience of what occurred in 2011 up to the year 2017 and 18 and 19. What occurred under ISIS, what occurred under Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the former name of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Nusra Front, which was a cover for Al-Qaeda in Syria. So further down, a US lawmaker is hopeful for a democratic Syria. So all of a sudden, the US wants a democratic Syria. And I have to address the naivety of some of our comrades, to use a communist term, some of our comrades, Sunni people like ourselves, who actually believe this will lead to a democratic Syria. And that America, the United States of America, is actually supporting a democratic Syria. So Democratic congressmen, the Democrats who have been giving war assistance, material assistance, war materials to whom? To Benjamin Netanyahu. These Democratic congressmen, what do they state? Senator-elect Ruben Gallego says he is closely monitoring the updates out of Syria. The Bashar al-Assad regime, working with Russia and Iran, have caused one of the largest humanitarian crises of our time. Note the doublespeak. Yes, Russia and Iran and Bashar have caused one of the largest humanitarian crises of our times, but not Benjamin Netanyahu, according to this fool. This imbecile carries on. It is necessary that any future Syria be a place that respects human rights and religious minorities. Yes, Rubin, you imbecile. Jolani really respects religious minorities. That is the level of propaganda that is being spewed by the White House, and there are actual people who believe in this nonsense. They are actually naive to believe that Jolani will bring a democratic Syrian. And then there are more naive people who believe Jolani will actually bring the Khilafah Rashida, the rightly guided caliphate, not the false, the Dajjalic, false claim to caliphate of Awad Bakri, Awad Ibrahim, claims to be Bakri. He is not Bakri. He has no link to Sayyiduna Abu Bakr Siddiq radiyallahu an. What is Al-Khilafatu Rashida? It is the justice that was brought about by Sayyidina Umar radiyallahu an. Inshallah, we will take one more rounds of questions, and these events will continue unfolding. There are some updates. Of alleged Syrian army soldiers and allied fighters kneel on the floor after being captured by opposition fighters. There are also reports of Syrian Bashar al-Assad has spoken with the Emirati counterpart Mohammed bin Zayed al-Nahyan, as well as Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani, who voiced support for Damascus. The Syrian armed opposition announced an effort to expand safe areas and allow displaced civilians in the Idlib province to return to their homes in recently captured territories. Of course, what these rebels are not taking into account that those areas will be air raided. There will be, and there's a hadith in the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq that states, وَيْنٌ لِلْعَرَبِ مِنْ شَرٍ قَدْ اقْتَرَبَ. There are many hadiths that state this, but the hadith mentions wings specifically. Wings. That there will be wings. What is this alluding to? To Arabs from wings. It refers to the air raids that occur in Arab lands. There have been no nation that has been air raided as much as the Arabs in recent history. From Iraq to Libya to Palestine to Syria. We have observed with our own eyes thousands of Arabs being killed through air raids. So that the Syrian rebels are not taking into account the safety of the people. They will return back to their homes, but their homes will be air raided by the Assad regime. These are the considerations that I give, and as you can see from my discourse, I do not align myself with either side. I am on the side of safety of the Muslims, safety of all the civilians, Christians as well, safety of all human beings in the region. Insha'Allah ta'ala, we will be taking the serious questions. Do not go on to repeat mode of your old questions that we have covered in the past live streams. Someone states, despite the repercussions, is it still not better to fight against Bashar al-Assad and his Nusayri government? Is the jihad against Russian and Nusayri is not valid? Why stability and safety over jihad? Someone called Abdul. Abdul, are you at the forefront? Is your family under those bombardments? Why do you speak with romanticized speech, my friend? That the safety Syria saw prior to the current bombardments, it's not your children living in tents with no shoes in winter where they need to walk in the snow. Perhaps you wear Nike trainers worth over $100 and give no care and concern for those children. So if you believe that toppling the Nusayri regime, in reality it's a Baathist regime which has Nusayris and other affiliates, including Sunnis. It's a secular regime which has many Nusayris. If you believe that is an obligation, why are you encouraging that while sitting here and encouraging the endangerment of innocent people? Someone asks, is Athari Aqidah considered not Sunni? Is only Al-Aqidah Al-Tahawiyya Ahl Sunnah? The answer is Athari Creed is Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And Al-Aqidah Al-Tahawiyya includes the Ash'ari, Maturidi and the Athari Creed. Someone asks, why is the situation in Palestine so clear, yet the situation in Syria is so complex? Because of the complexities involved. The situation in Palestine is an occupation of a foreign group, a foreign ethnicity of Europeans from Poland and other places, like Benjamin Netanyahu, the Polish man, not a Semitic. While Syria has complexities due to the nature of its history, as well as the Baathist regime, as well as the persecution of various groups, and due to international interests in the region. Someone asks, Shaykh, in the past you mentioned a book you read that was entitled something like Why the British Conquered India. But you never mentioned the author. I can't find it anywhere online. The book is out of print. And I do have a copy. I will pass on the copy to someone who perhaps will scan the book and place it online, inshaAllah ta'ala. Similarly, I have a few books which are out of print, unavailable, and they are unavailable online. Can you tell us about the National Tullabul Ilm Day and what ulama institutes will be there? Inshallah, The Tulab al-Ilm conference will be on the 28th of December, Saturday 28th of December, 4 p.m. till 8 p.m. There will be speeches given by some of the Tulab al-Ilm on burning issues, on important issues that are occurring, and there will be more details released in the coming weeks. There will be more detail given on this conference. Insha'Allah ta'ala, within that conference we will be discussing political events as they unfold, the end of times, and similarly we will be covering the progression of Talab al-Ilm within the Western Hemisphere and within the UK specifically. Someone says, Asrar speaking on behalf of Muslims of Syria from across the world. I like Asrar, but please sometimes you speak with no clear vision. I do not speak on the behalf of Syrians. I give my own analysis of the situation. I do not represent Syrians. You are clearly free to disagree with me on this issue. Someone asks, brother, what have Barelvis done since 1920? Not one Mujahid group. Well, you need to ask those who have failed in making a group for jihad, but those in the Indian subcontinent would have to respond to you, especially groups in Kashmir and other areas. Inshallah ta'ala, we will conclude the live stream, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to better the situation in Bilad al-Sham, what is better for the Syrians, and to do that which safeguards their health, their safety, their children, their families, their homes, their cities, and the entire country. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.